Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you for attending our work session. We've got our illustrious finance department that is ready to take this over. Mr. Luckett.
Good evening, Mayor and Council. Can everyone hear me okay? Okay. This is going to be our final budget work session for this fiscal year before you see the proposed budget. And so tonight we wanted to talk to you about capital projects and kind of the associated funding that goes along with those, and kind of give you some updates on where we stand and how we compare to some of our neighbors. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Can everyone see that okay? Okay. So the purpose of this presentation is to update you all on the current list of approved capital projects. As we're going to be getting into some of the details of our 2022 budget in the coming weeks, we wanted to provide some context for you all regarding capital projects and kind of where we stand with those. And also just to look at some funding options for our 5-year capital improvement program. So for the presentation, we'll take a look at some different capital project types. We'll take a look at the list of what's currently approved. We wanted to provide you with some update on our debt levels and how we compare to our surrounding cities, and then just look at some available financing options. I did also want to point out to you all that in your packet, you do have a copy of the presentation. You also have a copy of, it's a listing of all of the current approved capital projects by department and fund, and I'll kind of show you that list here in just a few moments. So I wanted to start by just kind of giving some brief background on the types of capital projects and how we typically classify them here at the city. Usually we're talking about either maintenance capital or one-time capital projects. The big difference is that maintenance capital projects, we're maintaining a current asset. This is a maintenance programs that are recurring every single year. And I'll give you some examples of that in a moment. But typically these are funded with current revenues. They're recurring expenses, whereas with one-time capital, you're looking at, as it implies, a one-time project. We're usually constructing something new, or it's a complete replacement of something that's existing. And those projects are typically funded with non-recurring resources. So when it comes to one-time capital, typically we're funding those through general fund balance, which means, our reserves above our reserve policy, which are, funds that we had left over from prior years. Our T-SPLOST projects are all kind of one-time projects and are funded through the T-SPLOST revenue. The enterprise funds, our water and sewer, stormwater, solid waste, they're all funding their own capital projects through the revenues they collect through those user fees. And impact fees, those are also used to fund some of our capital projects. Other sources that we have that are not as typical could be our hotel motel funds. We have a portion of those revenues that can be dedicated to capital projects. Even our auto rental excise tax funds, those can be dedicated to certain types. There are restrictions in there, but those can be dedicated to certain types of capital projects. So here's just a few examples. When it comes to maintenance capital, the typical things that you all see, especially in our general fund, would be our citywide facilities maintenance program. Usually we're investing between $1.5 to $2 million annually to maintain city facilities and follow the plan, the program that's been developed for that. Our road resurfacing program, the parks maintenance program. So all of those are examples of maintenance capital from our general fund. Other funds can include things like water line replacement, as well as stormwater maintenance. In terms of one-time capital, in the general fund, we're talking about things like the replacement of Willio Bridge. That was primarily funded through general fund balance. The River Parks Master Plan implementation, that's a general fund, fund balance funded project for the most part. Other funds include things like, T-Splost fund is funding the Big Creek Parkway, as well as the recently approved solid waste transfer station is being funded in the solid waste fund through some issuance of debt. So with that, I wanted to show you really quickly the listing I was telling you about that's included in your packet. So as I mentioned, this list is a complete listing of all of the currently approved capital projects. It is included in your packet, and as you can see, it's organized by department, fund, and then the project. So for administration, we have the portion that's on the capital projects fund. You have the revised budget for the current fiscal year, how much has been spent to date, what funds are currently encumbered, and then the amount of funds remaining. So we go through each department, showing you all the different funding sources as well as the different projects. I did want to let you know, so this is the listing. It's just a listing of the capital projects, the current funding. But in terms of a status update of each project, you all are provided those updates, and we present that to you at a quarterly basis through our budget initiative progress report. So with that, I'll go back to the presentation. One of the other things that we usually put together each fiscal year as part of the budget process is our capital improvement plan. Capital improvement plan is part of the budget document that is included annually. It includes all the capital projects, both maintenance capital and one-time capital. And it includes the current funded year that you all are approving. So for this upcoming fiscal year, it'll be the FY 2022 budget. But it also includes the next 5 years after that, so that we can be made aware, we can make everyone aware of, what are some of the projects that are on the upcoming horizon. And the way that it's typically worked here in the city in the past and currently is that the projects that are in those outer years are typically more of a wish list. And I'll tell you that that's one area that we'd like to make some improvements on moving forward. Some of the practices that we see in other cities is that the capital improvement program or the capital improvement plan is a little more restrictive in terms of what actually makes it in. It's more of an actual plan of projects to be funded in the coming fiscal years. It doesn't mean that you have to stick to it. You can make amendments to that plan. But it's a little more realistic plan in terms of looking at what funding sources we actually have available, and then what are the biggest priorities that can fit within those funding sources. So that's one thing that we'll be working on to bring to you all as we move forward. I also wanted to give you all an update or a slide here that shows you kind of a historical perspective on the capital investment of the city. And this is just including the general fund only. So as you can see here, it shows you both the maintenance capital and the one-time capital projects. And you can see it varies by fiscal year. And really that's just a product of the available funding for that particular fiscal year. As I mentioned before, with our maintenance capital, this is coming out of our recurring revenues on an annual basis, whereas the red that you see is really a product of, how much fund balance or one-time revenue sources do we have to dedicate to some of these one-time capital projects. This slide shows you a pie chart of our current capital projects by department. So as you can see, we're at about $92.2 million. The bulk of those projects are in our transportation department, and that's mainly because of the T-Splost program that makes up the bulk of that. Other major sources include the Environmental Public Works Department at about 8.2 million, Recreation and Parks at 3.5, Administration at 3.2, and then it kind of just goes on from there. We also wanted to show you an overview of our projects by, if we were to split them between maintenance capital and one-time capital. So you can see here that our maintenance capital makes up about 17% of our total capital program, and one-time capital is about 83%. And again, most of that one-time capital is related to the T-SPLOST program. Next, we wanted to just provide an update on kind of our city debt levels as they stand today and how we compare to some of our neighbors. Before we do that, I just wanted to give you a little bit of background information about debt and typically how that's handled here. Usually, debt is used for projects that kind of meet some of the following conditions, either one-time capital projects, or maybe we're trying to catch up on some deferred maintenance. That's never really a goal of ours, but if we've been in a situation where we haven't been able to allocate funding to maintenance over several years, then we would try and catch up on that. If it's a project that's so large that it would take years to kind of accumulate enough reserves to do a pay-as-you-go, so debt may be the best option. Also, we want to take into consideration this concept of intergenerational equity. Basically, what we mean by that is if we are about to, if we need to build a new facility, maybe a fire station that's going to be around for 30 or 40 years, we want to spread the cost across that time period so that everybody that's benefiting from that fire station, the services that are provided through it, are kind of having a share or paying their share as the years go on. I will say in the past here for the city of Roswell, we haven't typically pushed that concept of intergenerational equity, mainly because we've been fairly conservative in terms of the debt term that we're willing to go out. And the practice here usually has been around 10 years in terms of, and the last bond issuance that we did was a 10-year bond. I will point out that some of our surrounding neighbors are taking more advantage of taking those longer debt terms to kind of pay for these projects across the years of the individuals that will be using those facilities or whatever it might be. Just to give you a few examples, some of the bond issuances that Alpharetta has done, they're as long as 20 to 25 years. The city of Johns Creek has gone as high as 30 years. Milton, 15 to 20 years, and Sandy Springs has been about 20 years as well. When we talk about utilizing debt, we want to take several things into consideration. Kind of going back to that whole issue of intergenerational equity, we want to match the term of the debt to the useful life of the asset. So we wouldn't want to fund a vehicle, maybe a fire truck that's going to be around for 10 years. We wouldn't want to finance that over 20 years or 30 years. So that's basically what that means. Also, we have to consider the affordability of the annual debt service. And do we have the capacity to cover the annual debt service payments that will result? Other ideas we have to think about, what is the impact on the annual operating budget? So if we are constructing a brand new fire station, an additional one, we're going to have to take into account the personnel, the equipment, and all the other operating costs that will have to be funded through our operating budget. When it comes to the cost of debt issuance, we're talking about things like interest costs, the actual cost of issuance. So there's a lot of different players that are involved when it comes to issuing debt, and they all kind of have their own separate fees. And then, of course, we think about what is the most appropriate financing tool that we have. So this next chart kind of gives you an idea of our current tax-supported, city tax-supported debt. And when I say city tax-supported, I'm primarily talking about what's funded through just regular city taxes, like general fund, property taxes, sales tax, things like that. Here, we will start with our general obligation bonds. So the original issuance of those bonds, that was back in 2013 and 2014. The total issuance was $14.7 million. Currently, we have about $5.3 million outstanding. Like as I mentioned, those were 10-year bonds. So a portion of them will pay off in 2023, and then the remaining portion will pay off in 2024. The rate on those bonds ranged from 1.27% to 1.579%. Next, we have 2 loans through the Georgia Environmental Finance Authority, GEFA. That total issuance was a little over $3.7 million. We have about $2.9 million outstanding. This debt was issued for the purchase of the 7 branches properties. Those were 10-year loans, and they are scheduled to be paid off in 2029. Our interest rate is 0.5%. And next, we have 2 installment agreements. These were 2 debt issuances we used to fund the purchase of Mimosa Hall, as well as the Chafin Road property. So the total issuance was about $6.5 million. We have about $4.3 million outstanding. Again, those were 10-year term debt. Those will pay off in between 2026 and 2028. The rate on that was ranged from 1.83 to 2.25%. And then finally, we have our capital leases. So this includes, we use capital leases a lot to pay for, equipment that's higher in cost, primarily our fire trucks. We've also used this to fund some of our major upgrades to our IT infrastructure over the last couple of years. Total original issuance for those capital leases is a little over $7 million. We have a little over $4 million outstanding. Those terms you can see are vary widely, and that's because of, we're matching the term of the debt to the useful life. So with the IT equipment, we're more on the short end. We're 3 to 4 years. The fire trucks, especially like a ladder truck, we're talking more like 10 years. So those range in payoff from 2023 to 2029 with rates about between 2.14 to 2.72. So total city tax supported debt of about $16.7 million. And all of that's as of June 30, 2020. And all this information kind of comes from our most recent financial report, comprehensive annual financial report. I will point out here too that, what will get added to this, assuming you all approve it in the next council meeting, we have the GTIB loan for some resurfacing catch up. So that would fall into this chart here. And that, as we mentioned at the last committee meeting, is a 15-year term, an interest rate, I think, of about 1.2%. Next, we're talking about debt that's supported through city fees. And these would be the monthly user fees that are paid through our solid waste fund, as well as our water fund. So both of these are debt issuances were through our the Georgia Environmental Finance Authority. The first one being for the construction of the new water plant. That was about $14.5 million. We have about 13.3 outstanding currently. That was 20-year debt at a rate of 1.4%. The next one is the GEFA loan for the transfer station, the new solid waste transfer station, which is about to get under construction. That was $3 million issuance, and we haven't finished that project yet, so the $3 million is still outstanding. That's a 20-year debt issuance with a rate of 0.63%. So the next part of our presentation, we wanted to just provide you with some information about how we compare with some of our surrounding cities when it comes to the utilization of debt. Before we get into actually how we compare on a debt basis, I did want to give you a few bits of information about how we compare in terms of the property tax digest, because that plays a large role into the amount of debt that is feasible, that's affordable. So I wanted to kind of set that stage first before we actually talked about how we compare with debt utilization. So I will apologize, this slide is not in your packet. It got added kind of late, but I wanted to include this data in here just for your information. So this chart shows you the total tax digest for each of our surrounding cities. This is for tax year 2020, and this is the assessed value. So this is the 40% of the full value. And so as you can see here, we're kind of right in the middle of our surrounding cities with our total tax digest at about $6.2 billion. Sandy Springs is the largest at $10 billion. Milton is about $3.2 billion. And we're kind of right in the neighborhood in terms of total tax digest of Alpharetta and Johns Creek. The next slide shows you how our tax digest is broken down into its various components. And really what we've done is we've split this between residential, commercial, and other. And so as you can see here, as you know, Roswell is about a 75-25 split between commercial or residential and commercial. We're much more in line with Milton and Johns Creek, as you can see. They have a little more residential and less commercial than we do, but we're kind of in the same ballpark there. Alpharetta and Sandy Springs are much more similar in terms of their split. Alpharetta, as you can see, is about a 50-50 split in terms of residential and commercial. Sandy Springs close to that, but a little more on the residential side than commercial. But that'll kind of play into some of the statistics that we wanted to share with you. So first we wanted to get into measures of total debt. And so here what we're showing is total direct debt. And what we mean by that is basically the total of all debt that is listed in each of these cities' comprehensive annual financial reports. I did want to point out, and you can see in the footnote at the bottom there, what we've done is we've actually excluded a few items that aren't really capital project related. So we've excluded pension liability, other claims, compensated absences. Those are things we're required to report as part of debt, but it doesn't really factor into what you typically consider as traditional debt or debt related to capital projects. So what this shows you on this slide, this is total direct debt. So it's just a measure of how much debt each city has. Sandy Springs is at the top with about $173 million in total debt. Roswell's at the bottom, about 16.7 million. You can see, again, we're definitely on the lower side. Johns Creek and Milton, 32 to 65.9, and Alpharetta is kind of closer to Sandy Springs at about $115 million. Just to give you an idea of kind of what is included in these numbers, what kind of projects have been financed. The $173 million in Sandy Springs primarily is for their city center, their performing arts center. Alpharetta, we're talking about, just general bond issuance for, park improvements or new parks, transportation projects, their city center. It also includes some financings they've done through their development authority to help fund the construction of Gwinnett Tech, as well as their conference center at Avalon. Johns Creek, they have a large bond issuance that went to parks, but their debt includes funding for their new city hall. Milton, again, they had a large bond issuance for parks, but they also have some debt in there for some of their public facilities as well. And also wanted to point out too that these numbers come from the most recently available financial report. So Johns Creek and Milton are all on an October 1st fiscal year, whereas the other three were all on a July 1st fiscal year. This next chart shows you total direct debt per capita. So if we take that total amount that we saw on the previous slide and divided that by the number of residents in each city, here's what that amount is per resident. So for Alpharetta, you can see they're kind of at the top at about $1,700 per resident. City of Roswell is at the bottom, $177 per resident. I will say, based on what we saw earlier with the property tax digest, we would want to, in this situation, kind of compare ourselves more to Milton and Johns Creek. Because as we saw, Alpharetta and Sandy Springs both have a substantial commercial base that they're able to utilize to help fund some of the debt. So this isn't necessarily the residents aren't bearing the full brunt of the debt that's been issued here. They can spread it across residential and commercial properties, whereas, Milton, Johns Creek, as well as ourselves, we're more resident heavy. And so I would compare in this situation, where we stand both with Milton and Johns Creek. And you can see even on that end of the spectrum, we're on the low side compared to both of those cities. This chart shows you the total direct debt as a percent of the property digest, the full value property digest. And so this kind of helps equalize, the differences between residential and commercial, and we're looking at just what is the direct debt as a percent of the total digest. And so as you can see here, even in that measure, Alpharetta is still at the top at about 0.72% of their total digest. And Roswell, again, we're at the bottom, 0.1% of our total digest. The next set of measures kind of looks at debt affordability, and specifically if we look at debt affordability for our residents. So this chart shows you the per capita debt, which is that number that we looked at earlier, as a percent of per capita personal income. And again here, because of the differences in our tax base with Alpharetta and Sandy Springs, we want to kind of look at them separately and then look at us in conjunction with Johns Creek and Milton. As you can see with Alpharetta and Sandy Springs, roughly a 50-50 split between commercial and residential. They're on the 3% side of, the per capita debt as a percent of per capita personal income. Johns Creek and Milton, hovering around 1.5%. And still, Roswell, we're even quite far below Johns Creek and Milton. We're at 0.3% when you look at this measure. This chart kind of takes into account is overlapping debt. And again, this is a measure that's in all of these different jurisdictions, comprehensive annual financial report. But what it does is it looks at not only the city debt, but it takes into account an estimated proportional share of the debt that's held by Fulton County as well as Fulton County schools. And so if we add all that debt up and divide that across all residents, this is what that amount looks like. And again, same principle applies here where we would want to kind of look at Alpharetta and Sandy Springs on their own and then compare ourselves more to Milton and Johns Creek because of our similarities in tax base. Both Alpharetta and Sandy Springs are kind of around the $2,000 per resident mark. Milton and Johns Creek closer to $1,000 to $1,100 per resident. We're again still substantially quite lower than even Milton and Johns Creek at about $400 per resident. Next, we want us to look at the measures of debt affordability when it comes to just the annual debt service and how well the city itself, the city budget, can handle annual debt service. I do want to point out before we get into what these numbers look like, it's important to keep in mind that when it comes to these measures of annual debt service, this is really kind of a snapshot in time. The percents that you see here really can differ for a variety of reasons. It could be that in one particular year, the debt service of a certain city was very low because of just how they structure their debt. So it's just important to keep that in mind as we look at these numbers. But what this shows you is if you take a look at the annual debt service as a percent of general fund and debt service fund revenue. So we're talking about the revenues of the general fund plus any revenues like property taxes that are specifically for debt service. So when we add that up, what we see is that Alpharetta's annual debt service as of FY 2020 was nearly 5% of their total general fund and debt service fund revenues. Here, Milton about 4.5%, Johns Creek 3.8%, Roswell 3.75%, and Sandy Springs at 3.3%. It's interesting to see that Sandy Springs, although they have the largest amount of debt, that's still quite a bit lower in terms of the surrounding cities, the amount of revenues they're dedicating to debt. And that's primarily because of just how large they are and the amount of tax base that they have to work with. If we take that annual debt service and we look at that on a per capita basis, here we show, again, Alpharetta at the top about $56 per person, Milton $37, Sandy Springs at $32, Roswell we're at $31, and Johns Creek is at $28. And again, same principle applies here where we're talking about this is just a snapshot in time. This can be driven by a lot of different factors that are kind of baked into their the structure of their debt. So the final section we wanted to get into looks at kind of future financing potential, and just to kind of give you some updates on what that looks like. This is information that's been provided by our financial advisor. As you might remember, they were here a year ago to present some of this information to you. But basically wanted to give you an update on what rates for municipal bonds look like. So this is a benchmark yield curve for municipal bonds. This is for AAA, which is what we are. And basically this shows you what the rates were as of March 18th of 2021. So in this chart in the table 2, the years going across the bottom show you, the length of the debt service, and then the interest rates go up the y-axis here. These blue bars show you what the current rates are, and then you can see what they were a year ago, 3 years ago, and 5 years ago. So the bottom line here is that, rates are a lot lower today than they were a year, 3 years, 5 years ago. Next, we wanted to show you how the change in what that change in the yield curve has looked like over the past several years. So this chart down here at the bottom compares what rates look like back on January 1st of 2021 compared to just a few weeks ago here in March of 2021. And what you see is that even just in a matter of a couple of months, rates have gone up. And you can primarily, attribute that to just increasing confidence in the condition of the economy and, a positive outlook in the coming months that have driven rates up. So you can see in the bullet here, it talks about the 10, 20, and 30-year yields, or the interest rates have increased by 46, 47, and 46 basis points just in the last couple months. So rates kind of hit their low point last August when we had that initial surge in COVID cases. But just in the last few months, rates have increased because of, positive outlook. This chart just kind of shows you municipal bond issuance volume. So, the amount of debt issuance for municipalities that have occurred across the country. And you can see that despite the events of 2020, the year 2020 was actually 11% higher than 2019 in terms of municipal bond issuance. And the chart here at the bottom just gives you an idea weekly how much municipal debt is being issued and kind of how that compares to the average of both years. In terms of outlooks for interest rates, the Fed has kind of maintained interest rates since they were dropped during the initial stages of the COVID pandemic. Long term, they do expect rates to go up, but probably not through, the foreseeable next few quarters. And then just for discussion purposes, I wanted to provide you all kind of with what our debt capacity is if we were to be able to devote $1 million to new debt. So $1 million in terms of our property taxes equates to about $5.7 million that could be devoted to annual debt service. And this is really, again, just to illustrate kind of how that translates into projects and a dollar amount. So with that, for a 20-year term, the anticipated rate would be about 2.5%. That would yield about $89 million in funds that could be dedicated to specific projects. If we were to bump that term up to 25 years, the rate goes to about 3%, and then that would yield right at $100 million in funds that could be devoted to particular projects. Again, this is just a high-level illustrative information here for you. A lot of the devil would be in the details in terms of actual projects and timing and shovel readiness and all that information, but just want to give you an idea of kind of what that looked like. Also, if the city were to do a bond election in the future, just wanted to provide, what those dates look like. There's only certain dates, and it depends upon whether it's an odd numbered year or even numbered year in terms of what the dates are. So you can see for this current year, the only remaining date is the November general election, and we provide you what kind of our deadline would be in terms of calling that election. 2022, you have two options in May and November. 2023 is March and November. And then when you get into the presidential election years, you have February, May, and November as potential options if the city were to go down that path. Finally, we just wanted to highlight some other financing sources. We have obviously general obligation bonds, which we've talked a lot about, but we also have the option of using things like revenue bonds, which are similar, but have a dedicated funding source or revenue source to support that debt. Lease purchase, we use that a lot, like I mentioned before, when it comes to buying new equipment, but that can be another financing source. We can also, work with our Downtown Development Authority as they have the ability under state law to issue debt, and the city can kind of join with them in an intergovernmental agreement to help fund the debt service if they were to issue debt on our behalf for some particular project. The Georgia Transportation Infrastructure Bank, we're already, we've been talking about that because we're utilizing that source for a project. Other potential options, public-private partnerships, we can use that as an option. TADs are another option, and you heard that a few weeks ago in the presentation from Marta. So just wanted to throw a few other options, and there are more than that we can talk about if we needed to. So just to wrap things up, the next steps in our budget process, we have our April 26th Mayor Council meeting where we'll be presenting the FY 2022 proposed budget. April 28th, immediately following the committee meeting that week, the departments will be presenting their portion of the budget that's included for FY 2022. We'll have our first budget reading at the May 10th Mayor Council meeting, and the second budget reading is scheduled for the May 24th Mayor Council meeting. So with that, that concludes the presentation, and I'll be glad to answer any questions. Thank you.
Council, have any questions? A lot of information, and it'll take some time to digest. We don't have anyone in the public that would like to speak about this, so if council doesn't have any additional questions, I would like to thank our finance department for doing a great job as usual. And I will see you all back here at 7 o'clock. We are adjourned.